Hey, U.S. history students, welcome to our history lesson for today over the conditions of labor during the Gilded Age. Notice here we have exploitation of workers. Now, exploitation is not a positive thing, so today we're going to be kind of talking about some of the negatives of life in the Gilded Age, being a common worker. So, first thing I want you to always remember about life, working in a factory job during the Gilded Age, it's going to be long hours, low pay, and dangerous conditions. Okay, so long work day. We're talking 10 to 14 hours a day, depending on where you worked. Average work days a week is 6. If you're lucky, you would get a half day off on Saturday. And the employers are going to want to pay you the least amount of money that they can. And so pay range depending on how skilled you were for the work, depends on how much you got, but you didn't get paid very much. And with the influx of immigrants coming into the country, many immigrants would take less money, and so they would get paid less than the average. And then if you were a woman or a child, you can also expect to be paid less than the men. Also, if you're a worker during this time period of the Gilded Age, it's going to be not great conditions for the most part. You're going to be working in a dangerous place. There's not a lot of safety precautions in place. A lot of times it's boring and repetitive. So the factory owners found that if they could teach you to do one thing over and over and over and over again, you would get much faster at it and get better at it, and that could help them make more money. And with that being the case, they didn't have to hire someone with a lot of skills. You don't have to know anything to come in and do this one little thing over and over and over again. And it's dangerous. Okay, so people were injured, they were killed by accidents, and the bad news is there's no workers' comp or any insurance in place for you. And if you can't work, you can't get paid. And if you can't pay, you can't support yourself. So you're in trouble if you're a worker during this time period. If you're a child during this time period, there's a good chance that you were also working outside the home, in a textile mill, coal mine, different things. They used children because they were smaller. They could fit into tighter spaces. They could help fix machinery because they were a little bit smaller. And so child injuries are very high. Imagine a child around dangerous machinery without a bunch of safety precautions. A lot of the time it's not going to end up well. And these children, it was about 1 out of 5 on average, they missed out on their childhoods, on playing outside in the fresh air and getting an education. Like I was saying earlier, there's a lack of security for these type of workers. They could be fired for any reason, and when they were fired, or if they didn't have a job, or they were sick, and they couldn't work, they couldn't get paid. And so they were in a very vulnerable situation. So in order to combat these problems that workers faced, we see a rise in what we call labor unions. Now, the goal of these unions is to create better pay and better conditions for its members, to help out its members. And the way they did this is they team up together. And when they team up, they have a better chance to negotiate. If I go to my boss on my own and say, hey, I want better pay and better conditions, he's going to say no, and if you don't like working here, you can quit. Whereas if all of the workers go to the boss together and say, hey, we want better conditions, and if we don't get it, we're going to stop working, that's going to be a little more, have a little better chance of making the boss think about it, because if everyone stops working, the boss is kind of set up to lose a little money. Okay, so that's called a strike, when they refuse to work because they're demanding better pay, better conditions, better hours, whatever, and they will strike if those demands are not met. So you see labor unions rising up to try to combat some of these problems that workers are facing during the Gilded Age. I'm going to give you 2 national labor unions. The first one's going to be the Knights of Labor. It It was formed in 1869. The goal is to help workers. Their main demands are going to be here: 8-hour workday, higher wages, more safety in the factories. They were against child labor and equal pay for women. This organization began to fall apart towards the end of the 1800s. It was just loosely organized and just didn't hang on throughout the 1800s. The second one's going to be the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, founded by Samuel Gompers, 1881. This is to unite skilled workers. They had very similar goals, condensed a little bit more: 8-hour workday, better conditions, safer conditions, and higher pay. How did government of the United States feel about these labor unions? At the beginning, they didn't really like the labor union movement. Number one, business had a lot of influence on the government. They contributed to political campaigns. They had a lot of money. They had a lot of sway in Washington. And so the government was oftentimes on the side of the businesses and the business leaders. So that's number one. Number two, the government is fearful that these labor unions are going to hurt the economy because, in their minds, if a bunch of factories shut down because of striking workers, then the economy is going to start running slower because less things are going to be produced and less things are going to be bought and sold. And whenever something happens with the economy, government officials usually take the blame, and they want to do whatever they can to protect this disruption from occurring. And lastly, public opinion at the time was mostly in favor of the businesses. They felt like the government should be hands-off, that term laissez-faire that we've seen before. Laissez-faire policies, and so the government didn't feel like it should get involved. It didn't feel like it was its business to get involved. It said this is business for the factory owners and factory workers to work out for themselves. The government begins to change its tune as far as getting involved. When we get into the progressive era, early 1900s, one of the main reasons for this is what's called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. And what happened was there was a group of ladies working in a garment factory, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. The shirtwaist is a type of garment where they were sewing and creating, and their boss would let them in the morning. He would lock them in, and he would come back and let them out when it was time for them to go home. Well, he was doing that because he didn't want them to organize, because people would come around and try to get them organized into a labor union, and the boss didn't want that. And so one day they were locked in, and a fire broke out, and the fire trapped them because they were locked in, and many of the girls died from the heat, from the flames, and many died because they jumped out of the building to try to save themselves and just landed on the concrete below. And so this was a shocking, horrifying event, and we see this as a turning point because the government starts to get a little bit more involved at this point because people push the government to get involved at this point because of the horrific events of the fire. And so we see this, and we talk about this, historians talk about this as a turning point.